So we've looked at managing timescales, and we could utilise many of the tools that we've already mentioned, such as when we were talking about checking progress, such as work-based structures, Gantt charts, PERT diagrams, and then we can make sure we're still maintaining the critical path for the project using the PERT and the CPA. And we can start adjusting those sort of things. But making adjustments to any of those sort of scheduling or progress areas is probably going to involve implications for resources. So how do we manage that? Well, resource management is really about three things: allocating, aggregating, and scheduling. In that allocation stage, project managers have a responsibility for deciding what resources are needed to meet the outcomes that are required. That could be quantities of consumable resources, it could be total time, it could be effort required, it could be reusable resources like equipment, and it could be things like man hours. And the aggregation is all about dividing and splitting these resources over the length of the project. That could be days, weeks, months, to make best use of them and meet the critical path bits that we talked about. And finally, there's the scheduling, the stage that takes account of the limited availability of resources, because really there's no truly unlimited resources. And over time, things need to be split so that the limitations match up with what's available. And there's two ways of doing that. There's resource smoothing and resource leveling. Resource smoothing is used when time constraints are the priority. The objective is to complete the work by the required date. So whilst trying to avoid peaks and troughs in resource demand, a smoothed profile will inevitably involve delaying some work to let others carry on. So it needs to have flexibility in the schedule, and as long as it doesn't affect the critical path, then it can be used. The advantage is that it produces a more effective and cost-efficient use of resources. Whereas resource leveling comes into effect when the main factor is the limits on the availability of the resources. It simply answers the question, or puts the question of, with the resources available, when will the work be finished? It's based on what you've got and when you can do it. So managing resources effectively is critical for the successful, timely completion of any project. And one of the tools we can utilize is a resource histogram. Simplistically, it's a bar chart that shows specific amounts of time that a particular resource is scheduled to be used, predetermined sort of specific time periods. Here, the example shows man hours and trades available. It could be equipment, it could be supplies, and it allows us to compare the resource availability with what we have to what we really need, and therefore we can work out where to make changes. So it can be useful for that reallocation of resources or rescheduling, but it also can be a handy tool for just seeing what resources are available at a specific moment in time, or how those resources are tied up. Can be useful to look at if we've got changes coming along, and we'll be talking about those in a second, and to see where we can shift resources if we need to focus on the critical path, or if there's an impact from a risk or an issue that's come up. And I mentioned there risks, issues and changes, and we've mentioned these before because they all impact on resources and they all need to be managed. But as we've identified earlier, risks, issues and changes are different things and need to be managed slightly differently. Risk management is all about identifying, monitoring and mitigating against that risk. And issues and changes are more about reviewing, considering, and then checking the tolerances, seeing what are applicable and seeing if it fits within any variances that are acceptable. And there are many types of risks that we may face. Often they're focused around things such as that are new, such as a new supplier, a new process, new technologies. Those sort of things are definitely going to have a presence that will cause a risk. Or they could be things about dependency, so a sole supplier or only one customer, etc. And there's specific ones. It could be something like export license not being granted timely, system interfaces not being compatible when we get a new system in, a regulator introducing a new set of requirements, or severe weather is a common one in Britain that could impact on a project. But they're specifics, and we can group things into some sort of categories really. And the first is inadequate executive support. So wavering or inconsistent or weak commitment to the project is one of the biggest risks. This can be difficult but not impossible to document. We need to make sure we're asking about specific commitments, that we're getting things agreed, and where they're denied, we document this as a risk or a potential risk. The scope, if the quality of the estimates or the dependencies aren't very good, estimates are a guess. If they're a guess, then they're a risk. We need to work closely with stakeholders to make sure we're getting the requirements clear. We're documenting any tolerances or targets. We're ensuring that teams are clear about their targets and estimates, that we're recording and managing changes, and we'll talk about that more in a minute, and we're recording things incrementally so that we can defend against excessive changes and explain the consequences and make sure we're tracking that. Then there's friction with stakeholders. Any stakeholders with a negative attitude towards the project, or that we haven't engaged properly, may intentionally or unintentionally throw up roadblocks throughout the steps. Friction that may impact on the communication as well, which we'll talk about in a second. So we need to establish clear lines of communication. We talked about that in governance in session 1. We need a communication strategy. It all needs to be planned out. People need to know. If you anticipate conflict or the lack of cooperation between the stakeholders, you need to raise it as an issue, and then hold meetings and manage that. We need to record these things in the issue log and document them incrementally, and then we need to ensure that the project status is accurately updated to take account of these. And then there's poor communication, which we just highlighted on. Stakeholders will have expectations, and so will people within the team, and we need to make sure that we keep everyone on board. They need to be communicated with properly. We need to make sure that nobody's ignored, that we manage and revisit expectations regularly, and that we ensure those stakeholders that we just talked about don't become disengaged, because if they do, then they become a real risk. And then we can have things around resources and team issues. So insufficient resources available to perform planned areas because we've had a high turnover in a project team, or a lack of required skills, or subcontractors have let us down. All these sort of things can have an impact. And what can we do to try and sort of alleviate them? Well, we can have a workforce plan or a skills matrix, or we can cross-train people, or we can keep all informed and have alternative contractors available. We can check the references of contractors properly and make sure that they're clear on the requirements, the scope and the tolerances. Any conflict situations that start, we can manage them and put some sort of resolution in early rather than leaving it till it becomes an issue. And we can be proactive in team cohesion activities and proactive with our communication. Next is inadequate design. The feasibility and the flexibility of what we designed at the project's outset isn't clear. It's poor, it's low quality, or there's not enough detail in the design, and that leaves us with a risk. What we can do, we can highlight the design of and the complexity of it, and we can perhaps do some sort of experimental risk components and look at the risks in them individually. We could select the right model. We could go with Agile, for example, which allows us that flexibility. We can insist on the approved designs and specs being checked again and not leaving it to the last minute. And we can make sure that if we see that, we can allow sufficient time in the schedule to allow these things to be taken account of. Then there are technical risks. So here we're talking about components or technology that won't be of sufficient quality. It could be stability, availability, scalability, anything. What we need to do is make sure we validate the requirements and the designs and the specs at the beginning. Identify any specific components that are part of that critical path that we talked about. Do any reviewing or testing early on. Analyze and causes. We talked about that when we talked about some of the tools we can use. Try and identify the causes and the concerns, and then track any discrepancies. And it could have come from poorly defined requirements. The old adage is that garbage in, garbage out. If what's set down isn't feasible or in line with objectives or hasn't got reality check to it, then we need to make sure that we challenge it. If we identify it as a risk in the requirements, we need to challenge the feasibility, the quality, or the completeness of the requirements. Get it clear and get it complete so that it can be agreed by all at the beginning. An obvious one could be around quality issues, and the problem here is we must anticipate that there will be some defects as we go through and that everything won't work perfectly, and we need to be sure that we've got some relevant quality standards that we can identify against. And if it happens, we need to be identifying the quality related risks and showing where that can impact on the processes for the inputs and the outputs. And we also need to be identifying quality risks in infrastructure, work packages, in the components and the products that we're using. Then there's overly optimistic scheduling, and it's a common one. People trying to get an overly tight schedule or time scales and not realizing the risk it puts in. There should be some contingency in that time scheduling, in that time scale. We need to incorporate it because it could be for things like changes, staff sickness, downtime through equipment failure. We can use our SMEs to get advice and agree where those things could come from. We need to be looking at discrepancies and precedents using our PERT and CPA that we talked about, so we know what the knock-on effects will be. And any over-optimistic schedules, we need to be challenging them. We can't be setting ourselves up for failure by promising today what we can't deliver till tomorrow, for example. So those are the common ones. We've also got some other more sort of general ones, and they're things such as authority issues. So making sure that we have the appropriate authority and getting that identified and sorting out at the beginning in case we get changes or issues that come up and we know that we can deal with them, or we have to go back to the project sponsor, etc. And then there are the external ones that we have little control over, but we'll need to build in some contingencies, such as, I don't know, changes to the law, regulations, the market changes, the product is a failure. We need to be thinking about those. And of course, we need to be considering any secondary risks that in mitigating one of these risks, that it changes other things and creates a risk on its own. Any of those identified risks could materialize, or others could just pop up, but whichever way they come, if they actually occur, they're issues that we need to manage. There are some key steps in managing issues. It's very similar to managing risks, but with more significance or importance, you might want to call it, as they are actually occurring, so the impact is now and real. And firstly, we should have a register or a log, bit like we would for risks, and ideally this would be a collaborative document, maybe online, like a spreadsheet where other people can access it, and then we'll transfer risks that happen onto this so they can be tracked and monitored. And people need to know when to access the log and how they access the log and what they should actually do when they raise issues on it, and they should always be a priority assigned, and or maybe even a severity, but it depends on the organisation, and we'll see the example. And from that, there should be some actions assigned. There should always be somebody in charge of that who's best equipped to deal with that, and who we can go back to check that things are going along as they are, because we need to, as it says there were 5, monitor and update the progress. So we need to be able to check on it and then add a sort of commentary to the record, so that at the end, and then 6 there, that we can identify the impact. We can look back at the escalations and make sure that the actions have been measured, so that we can reflect on and make adjustments in the future. So here's a simple example, as I said, we'd look at one, and this just really highlights the first 6 steps. So we've got an identification, we've got a brief description, a type of delay, that might be something you want or not, but we definitely need a date raised, who it was raised by, some sort of priority, and in this one they've used the red, amber, green, the RAG we talked about. They've come up with a coding for the severity, the impact it's going to have, so they have level 1 or level 2, and they may have used some sort of sensitivity analysis, and we'll look at that to decide that. Well, then who's responsible, and in this case they've then had an action log where they've got things logged, because we want to see a log of what's happened and when it's happened. That might be in a separate document or a link because it might fill too much information in this. We then got status, closed, or on the other one it's still open and the date it was updated, and then finally the date it was closed. And this will help us to then do number 7, which is approve and evaluate the resolution, because it's not just about closing it. When it's resolved, we need to check that it's been resolved, that it works effectively, and we need to record any impact. That could be a benefit it's brought, because sometimes these things bring up a benefit, or it could be an impact on cost, time, or scope of the project, or, and another thing we need to be careful of, it could have made secondary risks arise due to the changes or whatever. And then 8, we need to close it, and that's not about deleting it or removing it. It needs to stay on the register. We may just shade it, or we may just color code it differently. And number 9, it needs to remain factual and transparent. What I mean by that is it needs to be about the facts that happen, not opinions and feelings, and it needs to be visible to all stakeholders so they can see the issue log. It's not something secret. So it's imperative for effective project management that we are tracking issues and risks. Now, risks is going to be more at the planning stage, and issues as they occur and ongoing. So issues can be recorded in an issues log and register, and they should be discussed almost every day, while the risks recorded in the risk log and register will probably be reviewed sort of periodically. For example, if a project is going to last 2 years, it would be overkill perhaps to review the risks every week, as they should have been analysed at the planning stage and prioritised. But the issues are the risks that are now happening, and they need to be at the top of the agenda, so they're probably going to be reviewed at every team meeting as well as every day. And at every team meeting, that's going to be an ongoing look at the issues and a decision so that everybody can look at them and decide if there's any secondary risks. This is where that understanding and transparency comes in. So as these issues are resolved, there could lead to changes. And also changes can just come out of the blue. The sponsor could decide that there's something that needs changing, or one of the risks that happens could cause a change. But however the change comes about, we need to be able to manage those and review the potential impact of those changes. It could be a single change, or it could be a continuous flow of complex changes that sort of escalate the complexity of our project before we realise that it's gone completely out of scope and it's off course. We also need to manage the process of change requests as well, as lots of changes unmanaged can make people start to feel or give a perception that the project is doomed to failure, that it's going to go off budget, that things are out of control, and that can have an impact on individual stakeholders, and they could be clients, and they could become disheartened or negative, and we talked about keeping them engaged before. So we'll have a look at how we're going to look at managing changes to the project. So key to managing changes in our project are, firstly, we need a change request system, somewhere where we can track, ensure that changes are implemented, log the reasons why, the authority that was given on why the changes were made, and where all the potential impacts, future risks can be logged. Secondly, we need to be able to assess the impact of those on the scope of the project, on the schedule, the finances, the risks, the quality and the resources, because we may need to look at impacts and change all those. And then we need to understand the tolerances and make sure that there is autonomy there for people to resolve these issues or the changes that come from this. So can people just get on with their own? Have they got to come back to the project team or the project manager all the time as they take things forward? And what are the tolerances? How far can we allow people to vary things to get these changes through the project? So these are key things we've got to consider as we're going through or having any changes in our project. So it's vital that details of any changes are logged in our change requests, because they may have an impact on the outcome of the project, and that might be what it's judged on. We'll look at evaluation in a minute, and it might also change what is judged as a success. If we haven't tracked and logged it and got the details of how we've analysed it, it could be too late when at the end we say, oh, we failed because of that change that we did. And if we cannot substantiate or justify or reflect on that change, then it's going to cause problems. One tool we can use in reviewing the potential impact of a change, and At the request stage is a sensitivity analysis. We mentioned it at the beginning in the tools and techniques, and then we briefly referred back to it again when we were looking at logs at registers. So let's have a look at that in a bit more detail. So sensitivity analysis can be used to analyse risks, as we talked about earlier, or to model changes that we're going to use on the project. And we do that by considering all aspects of the project and their potential impact on the overall goal. Because knowing the level of impact on the various elements, so the scope, the timescale, can assist us to manage and set priorities so that we ensure that we reach the end goal, or at least stay on the critical path to achieving things in a timescale that we're looking at. Sometimes it's known as a what if or simulation analysis, because it's about predicting the outcome of decisions given a certain range of variables. So if we change one thing, how will it impact on everything else? So taking the key quantitative data and the assumptions that we said for the project, we can use that to review and adjust systematically to assess their impact on the final outcome of the project. So what might a sensitivity analysis look like? Well, it can be displayed visually in a sort of bar chart, which is known as a tornado diagram, but that's just a way of displaying it visually. They can just be written, it could be a table or a report, but it displays the best and the worst case scenario for the different elements. So it can be compared with the project plan as it is in this simplistic example where you've got cost, timescales, technical risk, raw materials, quantity compared against the project plan in a simple percentage. And that's a very simple example, but it gives you an idea. So to summarize, it's really about considering and measuring the effects of project changes on the elements of the project and their overall impact on the objective. So if we extend the time scale, how's that going to impact on the budget? If we reduce the budget, are we still going to be able to complete on time? If we increase expenditure on staffing, is that going to bring us in on time, or are we going to finish early? So what would the impact be? And by modifying one event and keeping the others at the original planned levels that we had in the project plan, we can try and see which one would have the least or the most impact, and therefore the sensitivity that it poses to the overall project objectives. To do that, we're going to have key quantitative information. We're going to have the project plan that gives us good information, which is our baseline, and then we can consider the impact of those changes. And changes in the project could come in many variations. We may have changes to the project scope. So if you make changes to the scope, it could impact on the project goals, the deliverables, the features, functions, tasks, deadlines, and ultimately cost. It could be a change to the schedule. So that could impact on costs or resources. Maybe the risks are more likely to happen if we're trying to do things quicker, for example. Finances, that could impact on quality and the resources that are available, and ultimately impact on the overall scope, the goals, the outcomes, the deliverables, our timeframes. It could impact changes to the risks, could mean our risk register and log needs updating, and we may have to reassess those areas again. Changes in quality requirements could impact on costs and resources and may impact on the timescales up or down, or changes to the resources may impact on all areas. If we've got less of a resource or more of a resource or lower quality, that could have a big impact. So now a quick activity at the end of this part where we're going to look, it's a 3-part activity. Part 1 focuses on project management tools and techniques. Part 2 focuses on risk and issue management processes, and part 3 is a scenario based around changes to a project. So it's all risk, issues and changes. First part, tools and techniques. Second part, processes. And the third part asks you to do a little scenario based activity about changes to a specific project. Do those and upload them, and then you can move on to part 3.